The blade shears cleanly through the south fence wire in the freezing dark, too precise for accident, too quiet for chance. Someone chose this exact section on purpose. 3 years of drought have turned most of Cimarron County into a graveyard of empty ranches and abandoned dreams. Men sold what they could and left. But this place still has a yard swept clean before sunrise and a garden planted in circles that refuses to die. Inside the pale house, a woman sleeps upright in a wooden beside the cold hearth. Boots still on, revolver resting on her thigh, an open ledger across her knee. Above her, a faded certificate in a cracked frame proves the land is hers. Her eyes open, flat, ready. No wasted movement. On the trail above the house, horses stop. Boots hit frozen ground. They do not call out. She rises. The colt comes up with her. She moves toward the half-open door and listens. Past the silence, past the dead cottonwoods, for the one sound the drought could never silence. There is a kind of strength that doesn't make noise. It doesn't ride in on a showy horse, doesn't carry letters of introduction, doesn't wait for recognition before it starts working. It shows up before sunrise. Sweeps a yard no one will compliment. Plants a garden no one will praise. Holds a piece of land together with nothing but the refusal to quit. Rhett and Callum had built 280,000 acres on that same principle. He just didn't know someone else had too. Not until October 1878. Not until that particular cold morning on the Western Trail when he almost rode past a bleached house behind dead cottonwoods and kept going toward Cedar Falls like he'd planned. Almost October 1878. Cimarron County, Kansas Territory. 3 years of drought. 3 years of watching the sky make promises it didn't keep. 3 years of creeks going quiet one by one, like candles blown out in a long hallway. 3 years of wells going dry, and men selling off what their fathers had broken their backs to build. Because water stopped cooperating with ambition, and ambition alone couldn't save you. Reston had seen what the drought did. He'd watched it move across the county like a slow sluicer, taking the weak ones first, then the unlucky ones, then the ones who'd done everything right and still ran out of time. He'd bought water rights where he could, drilled where the ground allowed, moved his cattle twice a week to keep them off the creek banks long enough for the banks to recover. He checked his water himself, always had, always would. His foreman Bodie handled cattle, and Bodie was as good as any man Reston had ever worked alongside. Steady, quiet, right more often than not. Bodie handled fence schedules and feed decisions, and the 1,000 small judgments that kept 280,000 acres from slowly becoming 280,000 acres of problems. But Water Reston checked himself. Because in Cimarron County in 1878, water wasn't a resource. Water was the difference between an empire and a graveyard. And Reston Callum had not built what he built by letting other people decide what mattered most. His stallion moved steady beneath him on the Western Trail. The sky sat low and gray, the color of old tin left out too long. Cold that hadn't decided yet whether to become frost. The hesitating kind of cold that felt heavier than the committed kind. Because at least when the frost came you knew where you stood. He rode alone. The way he always rode when checking water. No conversation, no company, just the land and the sound of hooves and the particular quality of attention that came from having nothing else to do but look. He'd been riding this trail for 15 years. He thought he knew every foot of it. He almost missed the ranch entirely. It sat below the trail line, tucked behind 3 dead cottonwoods that stood with the particular stubbornness of things that had forgotten to fall down. The house was bleached pale as old bone, the kind of pale that meant years of sun and wind working on wood that hadn't been painted in a long time, maybe never. The south fence line, visible from the trail, had lost 3 sections completely. 2 more leaning at angles that would not survive the first real freeze. The barn roof had been patched in mismatched wood, some of it recent, some of it old deterioration made solid. He should have kept riding. The water boundary he needed to check was another 2 miles west. He had 4 more stops after that, before he turned back toward the main house. The sky was already doing what October skies did in Kansas, compressing the daylight, making everything feel more urgent than it already was. He should have kept riding, but he didn't, because of the yard. The yard was swept clean, not last week clean, not yesterday clean, this morning clean. A thin line of dust still hung in the still air, barely visible against the gray sky. Proof of someone who had risen before the cold and done the work anyway, not because anyone would notice, not because anyone would come and check, but because the work needed doing, and so it got done. Reston stopped his Sept's horse, sat for a moment, and then he saw the garden, along the eastern wall of the house, running maybe 30 feet October ground. Hard as iron. The kind of Kansas ground that fought back when you tried to turn it, that took your effort personally and gave nothing without argument. But someone had worked it anyway, broken it into something, not rows, circles. He'd never seen a garden planted in circles. Every garden he'd seen in 30 years of Kansas, settler gardens, ranch gardens, kitchen gardens behind townhouses, planted in rows, straight lines. The geometry of people who had come from somewhere else and brought their habits with them. This was different, corn in the center. Not one stalk, many, planted close enough to shelter each other from wind, far enough apart to breathe. Beans climbing the corn stalks, winding upward the way water found its path, not forced, just what was already there. Squash spreading low and wide around the base of everything, broad leaves covering the ground completely. A living blanket that left no bare soil exposed. No surface for the sun to crack and dry. Dormant now. October had taken the green out of it, but the structure remained. The intention remained. Retton sat on his horse and looked at it for longer than he'd looked at anything in a while. Then he looked at the creek, 20 yards beyond the garden's east wall, still running. A sound he hadn't heard in 2 miles of riding. Actual moving water, not the silence of a dry bed, or the thin trickle of something almost finished, running, in a county where everything else had gone quiet. He turned that over, let it sit. The squash labs had covered the ground so completely that no moisture could escape through the surface. No cracking, no evaporation. The beans. He knew this from something his grandfather had said once, something Reston had half forgotten and now half remembered. Beans put something back into the earth that corn took out. Fixed it, held it. The roots went deep in different directions, each plant doing something the others couldn't do alone. The whole system held moisture down where the sun couldn't reach it, where it could find its way to the underground feed and keep it fed, instead of burning off into the dry air. Not luck, not accident, not even instinct, exactly. Knowledge, the specific, accumulated, passed down kind of knowledge that didn't live in books, that lived in people. In the particular way certain people understood certain land, not as something to be conquered or managed or optimized, but as something to be in conversation with, something that gave back when you understood what it needed, something that held when you knew how to hold it. He sat on his horse and felt something go quiet in him. The kind of quiet that happened when you encountered something that outranked your assumptions. Then he dismounted, told himself it was to check the well boundary on the east side of the property. Knew that was a lie before he finished thinking it. The front door stood open, not wide, just ajar. The kind of open that meant someone was inside and not afraid of what the open door might let in. He stepped to the threshold and stopped inside. A woman slept in a wooden chair beside a cold hearth. Boots on, both of them, the kind of boots that had done real work in real weather, cracked at the left toe, re-soled at the right heel, broken in the way that meant broken to her foot specifically and no one else's. Sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, a worn revolver resting on her left thigh, her hand loose beside it, close enough, not gripping, not reaching, just close. An accounting ledger lay open across her knee. The last page dense with small, precise numbers, columns that ran clean to the margins. Figures that didn't waste space any more than she seemed to waste anything, anywhere. The handwriting, was steady and small, and looked like handwriting that had been doing this for a long time. On the wall above the cold fireplace, a land certificate in a cracked wooden frame, not decoration. Prof's Saya. Homestead Act 1862, Cimarron County, Kansas Territory, granted 1873. He stood at the threshold and read it fully, 5 years of proof. Under the Homestead Act, you worked the land for 5 years, and then it was yours. The certificate on the wall meant someone had started this claim in 1868 and stayed with it until 1873, and the government had verified every year of it. The frame was cracked, the paper was faded. It had been on that wall long enough for the light to work on it. He was still reading it. When she woke, no gasp, no scramble, no half-second of confusion between sleep and consciousness. Her eyes opened the way a door opens when someone on the other side has been waiting. With flat, immediate precision. She found him in under a second. Right hand moved toward the revolver. Stopped, assessed. The hand stayed where it was. She didn't stand immediately. She looked at him, the way you looked at a problem you'd encountered before and were deciding whether this version was different from the last one. Not afraid, not angry, taking inventory. The way you took inventory of a fence line or a water level, methodically, without rushing, because rushing led to missing things and missing things cost you. She had trained some part of herself to stay awake even in sleep. Retton understood that, more than he would have said out loud. You're on my land, not a question, not an accusation. A fact being entered into the record. I am, Reston said. He stayed in the doorway, both feet on the threshold, not inside. Door was open. She stood then, one motion, no stages. Closed the ledger without looking at it. The way you closed something, you knew by feel, by weight, by the particular resistance of familiar pages. Set it on the seat of the chair behind her. She was perhaps 35. The posture of someone who had spent years compensating for weight missing from the other side of things. Not broken by the absence. Recalibrated around it, permanently adjusted. The way a tree grew around an obstacle, still growing, just not in a straight line anymore. Saya, she said one word. Offered like something measured out carefully. Here is exactly what I'm giving you. Not more, Reston Callum, a short silence. The wind found something to push against on the far side of the house and pushed it. I know who you are, she said. Not warm, not cold, just information. Offered because withholding it would have been a kind of performance. And she didn't seem interested in performing. He looked at the certificate on the wall, at the name on it. At her. How long have you been working this land, he asked. Since my husband filed the claim in 68, she said. He died in 76. I've been maintaining it since maintaining, he said. Running requires resources, she said. Maintaining requires will. He looked at the cold hearth. The letter on the chair. The revolver. Your fence is down, he said. I know, she said. He asked about the fence. She didn't stop him from looking. Retton walked the south line alone, taking his time with it. 3 sections down completely. Posts rotted at the base. The rot working upward from where the wood met the ground, which was where rot always started. Wire slack and useless, lying in the dead grass. 2 more sections failing. Leaning at the particular angle that looked like they were tired, and considering lying down, the original work had been good. He could see that clearly. Correct post depth. Whoever had sunk these posts knew what they were doing, knew that the difference between a post that lasted and a post that didn't was almost entirely about how far down it went. Right wire gauge for the application. Solid corner construction. Good decisions made by someone who understood the work. Time had done what it always did. Finished what neglect had started. And in a drought year, with no cattle to fence and no income to justify repairs, the fence had waited. The way everything waited. When you were maintaining, instead of running, he thought about what a broken fence meant now, 4 years ago. Before Glidden's wire changed everything, a broken fence was an inconvenience. You fixed it when you got to it. The cattle drifted a little. You rounded them up. Now it was different. Now fencing was survival. A gap in your line wasn't just a gap. It was an invitation for boundary disputes, for drifting herds that became someone else's problem that somehow became your fault, for the particular kind of neighbor who arrived with a surveyor and a lawyer, and a pleasant expression while he explained very calmly how your property was actually a matter of some legal complexity that he'd be happy to resolve. Sayo. Fence down was not a small problem. He walked back, found her in the garden, working between the dormant squash mounds with a short hoe, turning the straw mulch, checking what was underneath it the way you checked on something you'd put a lot of work into and wanted to still be there. Her hands were raw at the knuckles. The kind of rawness that built over weeks, not days. The kind that came from work in cold air, without enough time between tasks for the skin to catch up with the demands being made of it. She kept hoeing when she heard him coming. 3 sections gone, he said. He stopped at the garden's edge. Any stock you try to run this spring drifts onto the neighboring pasture inside a week. She kept hoeing. She already knew. He could tell by the way she didn't react. Not with surprise. Not with the particular tightening of someone hearing bad news for the first time. She'd known it was coming for a while and had been living with knowing it. What would it take to fix it? She asked. Not looking up. Pricing a problem. Not asking for rescue. There was a difference between those two things, and she was clearly aware of the difference. 6 days. 2 good men. Materials for the full south line, and a section on the east side that's going soft. She stopped. Looked at him then. Full attention. In exchange for something, she said. Yes, say it. Winter lease on the East Creek water rights. 8 weeks of cattle movement per season. 3 years. Fair market rate, accounting for drought-cut conditions. That covers the fence crew, the materials, and the barn roof before first freeze. She was quiet. Looked back at the dormant garden. Looked at the creek put beyond it, still running in the dry silence of everything else around it. Come inside, she said. I'll hear it properly. The table between them was small. A kitchen table, scarred from years of use, with the particular worn quality of furniture that had been in one place long enough to belong to it. She put a sheet of paper on it. Set a pen beside the paper, write the terms, so he wrote them. The lease period, the 8 weeks per season and how they'd be scheduled. The rate, which was fair. He made sure it was fair, because an unfair deal with this woman would fall apart quickly, and he was interested in something that would hold. The fence work, the barn roof, the timeline for both. He pushed the paper toward her. She read it, slowly. Not performing slowness, actually reading. Every line, every word, the spaces between words where ambiguity could hide if you weren't paying attention. He watched her eyes move across the page and could tell she was parsing it, clause by clause, the way a careful person reads something that mattered. She read it again, 3rd pass, then she picked up the pen. She wrote 1 line at the bottom of the page. Slow and steady, the same hand she used for everything. Termination clause. If cattle damage the creek bank, measured at the crossing point, not downstream. The lease ends within 48 hours. No negotiation. She set the pen down, cleaved the paper back toward him. Retton read the line, read it again, and then he went very still because that clause, that exact, specific, precisely worded clause, addressed something he had left deliberately vague. He'd done it on purpose, not maliciously, but with the practical awareness that creek damage was easier to manage as a concept than as a defined measurement. Measured downstream, where impact distributed across a wider area, where it became diffuse and arguable, where attributing it to any one source turned into a long conversation. That vagueness had served him in other agreements. It gave room to maneuver. She had closed that room at the crossing point, where the cattle actually stood, where the evidence was immediate and undeniable, and couldn't be diffused downstream into debate. She had read the contract once, found the one place where the language left her exposed, and replaced it with precision, without a word about what she'd found, without accusation, without asking him whether it had been intentional. Just the correction, written in a steady hand. The correction of someone who had been caught by vague language before, and wasn't going to be caught again. Retton picked up the pen and signed. The crew arrived the next morning at first light, 4 men. Bodie driving the wagon, loaded with materials, more than the South Line strictly required, because Reston had been specific about wanting the work done right, which meant having extra on hand for whatever the land revealed once you started digging. Saya was already at the south fence line when they pulled up post-hole digger in her hands. Work gloves on, a canvas bag of small tools hanging from her left shoulder. The kind of bag packed by someone who'd thought through what the morning would need before the morning started. She didn't introduce herself, didn't explain her presence, or what she intended to do. She walked to the first failed section and positioned herself and started. Bodie watched her for 3 seconds, nodded once. The particular nod of someone who recognized competence without needing to comment on it. He turned and started unloading the wagon. They worked through the cold morning, without much conversation. There was a rhythm to it, the kind that emerged on its own when people knew what they were doing and trusted each other to know it too. No one had to say, "Do this, next, or wait for me." The work organized itself around the people doing it. Saya worked the line steadily. Not faster than the men, not slower. Just even, without the peaks and valleys of effort that came from working hard to prove something. Or from working in a way that was sustainable across a full day, rather than just impressive for the first 2 hours. She wasn't proving anything. She was doing the work. Around mid-morning, her shoulders began to ache in a way that reached bone, the deep ache that came from post-hole work in frozen ground, from the particular resistance of earth that had locked itself against the season. She felt it clearly, reset her grip, kept moving. She found a section that needed 7 posts instead of the 6 she'd planned for. The ground had shifted more than her measurements had accounted for. She'd miscalculated. It happened. She pulled the extra post from the supply wagon without mentioning the error and said it herself, not because she was hiding anything, because errors in calculation got corrected, not explained. Around midday, Bodie came to a section near the east corner where the soil changed under the digger. He pulled up a core sample, the way experienced men did without thinking about it, just wanting to know what was down there before committing the post. Turned it in his gloved hand, set the digger down, looked at the ground around him, looked at the fence line running east. The composition shifted at about 18 inches. Not dramatically, but enough. If you set a standard post here the way you'd set it anywhere else on this line, it would be standing at a slight angle by spring, leaning by summer. Down before the following winter, he looked around for the supply stack. There was 1 extra post set aside, leaning against the adjacent fence section to the left, not with the main supply. Here, close. Like it had been placed there before the crew started. Before anyone had dug a single hole in this section, he hadn't put it there. He looked at Saya, 25 yards away, working on the next section. Didn't look up. Just working. Bodie picked up the extra post, set it into the modified depth he needed for this section, said nothing. That evening, riding back toward the main Callum ranch, Bodie came alongside Riston. She put an extra post out by the east corner, he said. The section where the soil shifts at 18 inches. She left it there this morning before we started. Reston looked at him. She knew that section would need it, Bodie said. Before we dug. Before anyone looked at it. How? Bodie was quiet for a moment. I don't know, but she knew. Reston arrived the second afternoon with the notarized contract. 2 copies, proper signatures, proper certification. The kind of documentation that held up when someone decided to argue about what had been agreed. He found Saya at the fence line, standing with 1 boot pressed flat against the top of a newly set post. Not her weight on it, just her foot, her attention head tilted, listening to something in the post that he couldn't hear. "You added a drainage clause," she said, without looking up. He had cattle traffic across a creek crossing without drainage management, degraded the bank in 2 seasons. Standard knowledge among anyone who'd run cattle near water long enough. But it hadn't been in the original terms she'd agreed to. He'd added it in the notarized version. It protects you, he said. Not the lease. You. She took her foot off the post. Looked at him. Why? Not a question exactly. A request for the actual answer rather than the polite one. Because in 2 seasons, that bank would be compromised and we'd be in a dispute about whose cattle caused it and how much damage counted and when it started. This way there's no dispute. She held his gaze. The same assessment she'd given him the first morning, measuring, deciding. She took the contract from him. Both copies. Stood in the open field and read them, fully, both of them, with the wind working at the pages and the cold working at everything else. Signed, handed one copy back. Your crew is good, she said. Bodhi knows when to lead and when to follow. Said it the way she said everything, like information. Not exactly a compliment, and not exactly not one. Just accuracy offered to someone who might find it useful. He's worked for me 15 years, Reston said. You trust him, more than most things. She looked at the fence line, running straight and solid now to the far cottonwoods. He didn't ask me why I was working the line with him, she said. He just made room. That's what 15 years teaches a man, Reston said. When to ask and when to make room. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not quite. Something less comfortable than warmth and more valuable. The look of a person who'd expected something less and was recalibrating. She turned back toward the house. Water report for December, she said over her shoulder. I'll have it to Cedar Falls by the 15th. And she walked away that evening. Bodhi stopped by the barn on his way back to the bunkhouse, found Saya, inside, lantern in hand, working her way along the new roof boards, pressing her palm against each joint where new wood met old, applying pressure, listening for the give or the hold. She found 2 joints that needed an extra nail, set the lantern down, did it herself. Bodhi stood in the doorway for a while. Watching, Mr. Callum said something before we left the ranch yesterday morning, he said finally. Thought you ought to know, he said it. She didn't look up from the joint she was on, he said. She'll know more about what that place needs than any of you do. When she speaks, listen. Bodhi waited. Saya pressed her palm against the rafter once more, held it. Released it. Did he, she said. Yes, ma'am. Did your crew know that before you started? Yes, ma'am. Good, she said. And went back to the rafter. Bodhi nodded at nobody in particular and left. Saya stood in the repaired barn a long time after he'd gone. Lantern burning low, fresh pine and old hay. Warm light on walls that had been given more time. She thought about what Bodhi had said, not the words exactly. What they meant about how the work had been organized. Reston hadn't sent a crew to work on her ranch. He'd sent them to work with her. He'd told them to listen before anyone drove the first post. There was a difference between those 2 things. A considerable difference. She blew out the lantern and stood in the dark for a moment. Her father had taught her to read ground the way other fathers taught reading from books, as survival. Not optional, not a skill. A requirement of being alive in a particular place. He had taught her the creek, where it went underground, and where it came back up. The slight depression in a flat field that meant different earth below. The plants that grew where water stayed, and the plants that grew where it didn't. He had taught her that 3 sisters, corn, beans, squashed together, wasn't tradition for its own sake. It was science without the word for science. It was observation collected over generations and passed forward because it worked. He had taught her that knowledge kept to yourself died with you. Knowledge shared survived. She walked back to the house through the cold. The sky enormous above her, stars hard and close and paying no attention to any of this. She went inside, sat at the kitchen table, opened the ledger to a clean page, wrote the date, fence complete, barn roof complete. Contract signed and notarized, 2 copies. Creek, water rights, east section, 8 weeks per season. 3 years looked at what she'd written. He did. He told his crew to listen to me, closed the ledger, set the revolver on top of it, where she could reach it. Some promises required more than will to keep. This one wasn't finished, not even close. November came in hard. The first freeze locked the ground overnight. The kind of freeze that arrived while you slept and had made decisions about everything by morning. The creek had started building ice at the edges, slow gray plates extending toward the dark current in the center. The water still moving underneath, still finding its way. Saya was banking the garlic rose with straw when she heard a horse in the yard, not Reston's stallion. She knew that sound by now without meaning to. The particular rhythm of it, the weight of it, the way it moved on the Western Trail. She had cataloged it without deciding to. The way you cataloged things that appeared regularly in your life and mattered. This was different. A roan, showy, silver-trimmed tack that caught even the thin November light and sent it back bright. The kind of tack that announced itself, the kind that had no business in working country, as country didn't need announcing. It needed doing. The man dismounted without being invited, which told her everything. He was perhaps 50. Well-dressed for the cold, in a way that was also a performance. A long coat that said, "This weather doesn't inconvenience me." Boots that said, "I don't work in mud." He moved through the yard the way some men moved through spaces they'd already decided belonged to them eventually, unhurried, proprietary. Looking at things with the particular attention of someone taking note of their value, he surveyed the new fence line, the repaired barn roof, the garden under its careful straw mulch. He smiled at all of it. "Miss Saya, my name is Denton Pruell. I represent an investment consortium developing infrastructure in this region. I have a serious offer to make." Saya kept the straw fork in her hand, didn't set it down. "The land isn't for sale." Pruell's smile held steady. The smile of a man who'd heard that sentence many times and had learned that sentences changed under the right conditions. "I haven't mentioned a price yet. The price isn't the issue." He stepped further into the yard, past the gate, moving toward the house in the casual way of someone who considered thresholds to be suggestions. "Well," he stopped about 10 feet from her. "Let me mention it anyway. You might find it changes things." She looked at him, not at his coat or his silver tack or his unhurried manner, at his eyes, at what his eyes did when he smiled. Whether they participated in the smile or whether they were doing something else entirely while his mouth performed, they were doing something else. "I'll be back Friday," he said. "Give yourself some time with it." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted with the ease of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, rode back toward the trail without looking back. Saya watched until the dust from the roan's hooves had settled completely, until the trail held nothing but cold air. Then she went aside, opened the ledger to a clean page, wrote in the same steady hand she used for everything. Brian Pruell. November 4. First visit. Did not name his client, did not state a price, entered the yard without invitation, left before being asked to. She looked at that last line, underlined it. A man who managed when he left was a man who managed everything. She turned and looked at the certificate on the wall above the cold fireplace. Saya, Homestead Act 1862, Cimarron County, Kansas Territory. Granted 1873, faded paper, cracked frame. She had been 17 when her father died. He was Apache, from a band that had lived along the border country, between what was now Kansas Territory and the land to the south. People who had moved north, following the water sources. Her grandfather had mapped over 40 years of careful observation. When the government treaties pushed them off that land, her father had found this stretch of Cimarron County and understood it immediately. The water was here. The same underground system he'd learned from his own father, expressed differently on the surface but running from the same source. He had filed a homestead claim under a provision that allowed individuals of mixed heritage to claim land as citizens. He had worked that claim for 5 years and earned the certificate. He had died at 53. Lungs. A winter that wouldn't stop. She had been 17, old enough to understand what the certificate meant, old enough to understand what losing it would mean. She had married at 19, a good man, a quiet man, who learned the land from her instead of the other way around, and who never made her feel that was unusual. He had gone out one February morning in 1876 to check the south fence and hadn't come back. She'd found him herself, an hour before dark, 2 miles from the house, his horse standing quietly beside him where he'd fallen. She had buried him in the spring, when the ground let her. She had stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, because this land was the place her father had taught her to read, because the creek ran over stones he had named for her in Apache and in English both, because the garden grew where he had first shown her the Three Sisters method. This is how our people fed themselves when nothing else worked. He had said, remember it, and she had remembered it, and it had worked, and it was still working while everything around it dried and cracked and gave up. She was not giving up this land to a man with silver tack and managed exits. She sent a rider to Callum that same afternoon. Not to ask for help, to share information with someone who had a right to it. The note said, a man named Denton Pruell visited this morning. He is returning Friday. He represents a party he declined to name. He moved through this property the way men move through places they expect to eventually own. You have a lease on this land. I thought you should know. She read it. A dead one line at the bottom. I am not asking you to act. I am giving you information you have the right to have. What you do with it is your decision. Signed it top. Sent the rider. Retton arrived Thursday evening. 3 men with him. Quietly. No announcement. No production. The way serious people handled serious things before they became situations that couldn't be handled quietly anymore. He found Saya at the kitchen table, the ledger open, the Colt revolver beside it, not hidden, not displayed. Present the way. Out was present in a workspace, because it might be needed, and it was better to have it close than to need it and not have it. He sat down across from her without being invited, looked at the revolver, looked at her. You know how to use it, he said. Not a question. My husband taught me before he died, she said. He said, a woman alone on this land needed to be able to answer the door herself. She set the revolver on the table between them. Not toward him, not toward her. Between them. A fact acknowledged. I'm not waiting inside while Pruell walks my fence line, she said. That's not a discussion. Reston looked at her for a long moment. Nobody's asking you to. Something moved in her expression. The look of a person accurately read, who was deciding whether that was a comfort or a warning. She decided. Tell me what you know about Pruell, she said. So he told her. Denton Pruell had been working the western Kansas territory for 2 years. Moving ahead of land speculation the way drought moved ahead of planting season, always slightly in front, always preparing the ground for what came next. 9 parcels in Cimarron County, 2 more in the adjacent county to the east, 11 total in 24 months. All of them followed the same pattern. First visit, polite, well-dressed. An offer above market rate, because above market rate made people feel they were getting something rather than losing something. Second visit, information about development, infrastructure, opportunity. The future of the region, described in terms that sounded like inclusion but functioned as pressure. Third visit, a different quality of presence, nothing said outright, nothing that could be written down and held against him. Just the cold certainty that the conversation had moved past pledge stage into something with edges, and that continuing to say no would have consequences that weren't being stated, but were being clearly communicated. The sellers, widows, mostly drought-broke homesteaders, men whose 5-year proof under the Homestead Act was almost complete, but whose resources were already spent. People at the end of something. People who couldn't afford to hold on long enough for things to turn. All 11, Reston said. Same pattern, same timeline. He finds the ones who can't wait, and Judge Aldgate, Saya said. Retton stopped. What do you know about Aldgate? I checked the county land records in Cedar Falls last spring, she said. 3 of those sales went through his court without the standard 30-day review. The standard review exists for a reason. Skipping it exists for a different reason. You were already watching, Reston said. I have been watching since my husband died, she said. A woman alone on this land in this county learns to watch everything, or she loses everything before she knows what happened. She stood, went to the window, looked out at the dark yard. The fence line visible in the starlight, straight and solid and new, where it had been falling apart 2 months ago. They don't want this land because of a railroad, she said. The Southwest Valley has a subsurface grade of about 8 degrees running north to south. You can't see it standing on the surface, but you cannot lay rail across it without foundation costs 3 times higher than the alternative route 10 miles north. Any honest survey team would know that in half a day, Reston was quiet. The water, he said. My creek is the only surface water still running in a 20-mile radius, she said. It has run through 3 years of drought because of where the underground feed enters the system. My father knew where that was. He spent 30 years learning the land the way his father had learned it before him. He taught me. She turned from the window. They don't want my 320 acres. They want what's underneath it and what runs through it. And if they own the surface, they own access to everything below. Reston looked at the ledger on the table, at the neat columns in her steady handwriting, at the revolver, at the woman standing in lamplight, who had been reading this county's land and water for decades, first through her father's knowledge, then through her own, and had understood exactly what she was sitting on before anyone had thought to threaten her for it. Friday, he said. We'll be here, she nodded. Your men stay visible on the right side of the south fence, far enough back to be clear, close enough to mean something, and you? I'll be where I always am, she said. She looked at the certificate on the wall. On my land, Friday came cold and clear. The sky sharp and high. The light hard-edged, the kind that showed everything exactly as it was without softening anything. Pruell arrived mid-morning, 2 riders flanking him, clean coats. Eyes that had seen things and filed them away without visible effect. The kind of men who waited for instructions and were good at waiting. He pulled up at the south fence line, where Reston stood with 3 of his men, and beside Reston 6 feet to his left, Saya, boots on, the Colt on her hip, her eyes level and steady, her hands at her sides. The posture of someone who had decided before this moment exactly how this moment would go, and was standing inside that decision without any part of her doubting it. Pruell looked at Reston, calm. Didn't expect you personally. I inspect my water rights personally, Reston said. This creek runs through property under my lease. What happens here is my business. Pruell's gaze moved to Saya, at the revolver, at the men behind Reston, still, patient, unhurried. He took in all of it, without expression. Miss Saya still has until Sunday, he said. My offer stands. The offer is declined, Saya said. Her voice crossed the cold field without effort, not raised, not hard, just clear. The clarity of someone who had decided and was not deciding anymore. It was declined the first time you rode in here. It was declined when you sent men to cut my fence at night. It is declined now, standing here in front of witnesses, in full daylight, with the full understanding of what you are and what you intend. Silence. This land is not for sale. The next time you come onto it, without invitation, I will have the county sheriff here to meet you. That is not a threat. That is information. A long silence. Pruell's left rider shifted in his saddle. Just slightly. The shift of someone recalculating the other rider. Had found a fixed point somewhere beyond the fence lines and was committed to it. Pruell looked at Reston one more time, measuring, calculating, looking for the thing he could use, found nothing. He touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, rode. Nobody spoke for a moment after the hoofbeats faded into the cold distance, just the field. The sky. The creek moving quietly behind them, still running, still finding its way through the frozen edges. Then Bodhi, standing behind Reston's left shoulder, said quietly, "That's the first time I've seen Pruel leave, without paperwork in someone's hand." Reston looked at Saya. She was already walking back toward the house, not hurrying, not celebrating, walking the way she walked, with the steady, forward-moving pace of someone who had more work ahead and was moving toward it. At the door, she paused, turned back. "December water report will be ready by the 15th, she said, to rest on. Even now, went inside. Retton stood at the fence line, looked at the swept yard, the dormant garden under its straw, the barn with its new roof, the fence line running straight to the far cottonwoods, set right at the right depth, not going anywhere. Interesting woman, Bodhi said, quietly. Yes, Reston said. He looked at the house. She knew about the drainage issue before I put it in the contract, he said. She knew about the post section before you dug it. She knew Pruel's railroad argument was false before he finished making it. How does she know all of it? Bodhi asked. Retton was quiet for a long moment. Because she paid attention, he said. For a very long time. To things most people didn't think were worth paying attention to. He mounted up, looked at the certificate visible through the window one last time. Saya, Homestead Act 1862, Cimarron County, Kansas Territory. Granted 1873, he turned his horse toward home. Behind him, the creek kept running. The fence line held all the way to the far cottonwoods and beyond. And, inside the house, Saya sat down at the kitchen table, opened the ledger, wrote the date, November 8, 1878. Pruel left without paperwork, without argument, without anything. She looked at the words. He'll be back, she wrote. Not in person, in a different form. Closed the ledger, set it on the shelf, looked at the certificate on the wall, her name on it. Still there, still hers. She went to bed with her boots on, because it wasn't over. Not yet, but it was a start. She was right. He came back. Not in person, not right away. Not with the roan horse and the silver tack and the managed smile. He, the way pressure, always came back after it had been refused once. Quieter, more patient. Through different doors. Saya had written it in the ledger the night of November 8th. He'll be back. Not in purse form, she'd known. She always knew. The question was never whether it was coming. The question was always what shape it would take when it arrived, and what you would have ready when it did. November sailed into Cimarron County, like a creditor. Cold that meant business. Frost that didn't lift until mid-morning and was back before dark. The creek built ice from the edges in. Slow gray plates moving toward the dark center current. The water still running underneath, still finding its way south. Quieter now. More deliberate. Sayas monitored the crossing every other day. That was in the lease. Her responsibility. Water level at the crossing point. Ice conditions. Bank compression with the ACAL countdown to drink. She measured it carefully and wrote it carefully. And sent the weekly reports to Cedar Falls the way the contract required. Reston replied with brief notes, precise. Adding context to what she was tracking, cattle weight averaging higher this season, increased bank pressure possible. Recommend monitoring the north approach as well as the crossing itself. She read his notes twice. Added the north approach to her measurements. It was a correspondence of facts. That was what it was. Just facts. She told herself that on a Tuesday morning in the third week of November, when she found herself reading his latest note a third time, not because she'd missed anything, but because the handwriting was steady, deliberate, the handwriting of a man who thought before he wrote and meant what he put down, she closed the note. Put it in the ledger. Facts. Pruel's second move came on a Wednesday, not Pruel. Himself, a letter. Delivered by a rider she didn't recognize on a horse she didn't recognize, who handed her the envelope without a word and left before she'd finished reading the return address. Denton Pruel. Land acquisition. Dodge City, Kansas. She stood on the porch and opened it. Write it once. Slow, write it again. Slower, the letter was polite. Impeccably polite. The politeness of a document written by someone who understood that politeness was its own form of pressure. That a threatening letter could be refused as a threat, but a polite letter had to be engaged with on its own terms. You couldn't dismiss politeness without seeming unreasonable. That was the point of it. He had raised the offer, $1,800. And then, in the third paragraph, casual as weather, as you may be aware, a survey has been conducted for a proposed rail line connecting Dodge City to the Southwestern Territories. Early route assessments indicate that the corridor running through southern Cimarron County presents the most viable path. Properties within this corridor may be subject to acquisition under territorial provisions for public infrastructure development. It is my sincere hope that we can reach a voluntary agreement before such provisions become relevant. She read that paragraph 3 times, sincere hope. She set the letter on the kitchen table, went to the window, looked at the Southwest Valley, the long flat stretch that looked, to most eyes, exactly like all the other long flat stretches in Cimarron County. Same grass, same sky, same emptiness. But she knew what was underneath it. Her father had walked her across that valley when she was 8 years old, had stopped in the middle of it and crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the ground and told her to do the same. Feel to that, he had said. Tell me what you feel. She had pressed her 8-year-old palm against dry grass and felt something, a slight give. Not weakness, more like the earth breathing differently here than 20 feet in any other direction. Like something large was moving slowly underneath, moving with purpose, moving in a direction. The ground is different here, her father said. Why? She hadn't known then, but he had shown her, had explained the subsurface grade, the slow, invisible slope that ran north to south through this valley. The slope you couldn't see with your eyes, but that water knew about and responded to. The grade was approximately 8 degrees, enough to make the soil composition shift at depth, enough to make any serious engineering project across it dramatically more expensive than alternatives. Any railroad engineer worth his salary would find that slope in half a day of honest survey work, which meant Pruell's survey team hadn't done honest work, or they had. And Pruell knew the railroad wasn't coming here, and the letter was a tool, not information. Sincere hope. She picked up her pen, opened the ledger. November 19. Letter from Pruell. Offer raised to $5,800. Railroad threat introduced. Subsurface grade in Southwest Valley makes rail route impossible at stated cost. Pruell knows this, or his surveyors are incompetent. He is not working with incompetent surveyors. She paused, dead. They want the water, not the land. The land is the only way to get the water. Closed the ledger, sat with that for a while. The water, her creek. The only surface waters still running in a 20-mile radius after 3 years of drought, running because of where the underground feed entered the system, running because her father had understood that system, and she had inherited his understanding and built on it. They had figured it out. Someone had figured out on them. Either way, they knew. And knowing that they knew changed the shape of everything. She went outside and checked the creek crossing. Because the creek crossing needed checking regardless of what Denton Pruell wanted. The ice had built another inch overnight. The bank on the north approach was holding. The cattle crossing had compressed the soil slightly, but not beyond what she'd predicted. She wrote it all down when she came back in, because everything was evidence. Everything, always, had been. The fence came down on a Thursday night, 2 sections. The sections that had been rebuilt first. The ones with the new posts, the new wire, the work that Bodie's crew had done at the right depth. Clean cuts on the wire, not frayed. Not broken by pressure or weather, or the natural failure of old material. Cut. Saya found it at 5 in the morning when she made her first check of the day, stood there in the dark with her lantern, looked at the cuts, looked at the ground around the posts, hoof prints, fresh. A pattern she didn't recognize. The shoe had a particular shape at the toe, slightly squared, with a nail pattern she'd never seen on any horse in the county. Not local. She stood there for a long moment in the cold. The lantern made a small circle of light around her. Everything beyond it was dark and still and enormous. She could feel the anger. It was there. Specific and clean, not the panicked kind, not the helpless kind. The kind that knew exactly what it was responding to and exactly what it wanted to do about it. The kind that was useful if you let it work for you. Instead of against you, she let it be there. Then she went to the barn and got the post hole digger and the wire and the tools, and she came back to the south fence in the dark and started. The ground was frozen harder than it had been when the crew did this work. Every post hole fought her. Her shoulders ached before she'd finished the first section. Her hands were cold inside the gloves. Her breath came out in clouds that the lantern made briefly visible before the dark took them. She worked because the fence needed working on, because Pruell had cut it to see what she would do, and what she was going to do was fix it before dawn. Because that was the answer to that kind of question. Not words, not messages, not appeals to fairness. Just the fence. Fixed. Before anyone came to see what the damage had done to her, she was halfway through the second section when she heard a horse on the western approach. She knew that rhythm. Retton's stallion. She didn't stop working. He rode into the circle of lantern light and took in the scene without a word. The cut wire on the ground, the fresh posts she'd already reset, her shoulders and her breath and the digger working in frozen ground. At 5 in the morning, he dismounted, tied his horse, picked up the spare post that was leaning against the line. She didn't tell him where it went. He figured it out himself. They worked for an hour in the cold and the dark without speaking. The stars moved slowly overhead. The creek ran quietly beyond the tree line. When the second section was done, they both straightened at the same time, the way you straightened when a job was finished. The particular release of a body that has been doing one thing and can now stop. She looked at the fixed fence line. He looked at the cut wire on the ground. Bodie found the hoof prints yesterday afternoon, he said. Squared toe on the shoe. Nail pattern from a supplier in Dodge City. One of Pruell's hired men. I know, she said. You knew before I said it. I knew when I saw the cuts. The wire was sheared, not broken, and they cut the newest sections. Not the easiest to reach, the newest. Someone made a choice about which sections would hurt the most to lose. Reston looked at her. Why didn't you send word? She looked at him steadily. Because I was handling it. A silence. Long enough to mean something. You were handling it alone at 5 in the morning in frozen ground, he said. Yes. Because. Because it's my fence, she said. And because I needed to know I could. He didn't answer right away. The lantern flickered, caught itself. Held, did you? He asked. She looked at the repaired line. Both sections. Solid. Set right, yes, she said. They stood for a moment in the cold dark. The repaired fence between them and the empty field beyond. Reeton crouched down and picked up one of the cut wire sections. Examined the cut end in the lantern light. Put it in his coat pocket. Evidence, he said. Everything is evidence, she said. I've been treating it that way since November 4th. He looked at her. Since Pruell's first visit. Since before that, she said. Since my husband died and I understood that a woman alone on land that other people want is a woman who needs to be able to prove everything. The lantern light moved between them. What kind of proof do you have? He asked. Ledgeries, dated and timed. Every visit Pruell made, every word I could write down exactly. The railroad letter. His pattern of sales. I've been tracking those since last spring when I started checking the county land records. Reston was quiet. You've been building a case, he said. I've been being careful, she said. There's a difference. A case is something you build when you know you'll need it. Being careful is something you do because the alternative is losing what matters. She picked up the post hole digger and the tools and started walking back toward the barn. Come back in the afternoon if you have time, she said over her shoulder. There's something I need to tell you about Aldgate. He watched her go, stood at the fence line for a moment longer, alone, looking at the work she'd done in the dark before he arrived. Then he untied his horse and rode toward home in the early gray of coming dawn. He came back that afternoon, not about the fence. Not pretending it was about the fence. He came because there was something she needed to know, and he was the person who had it. She was hoeing between the dormant garden rows when he rode into the yard, turning the straw, checking what was underneath. The garlic was holding. The ground temperature down at root level was still above the threshold her father had taught her. You could tell by the color of the soil when you turned it. Dark enough meant warm enough. Still alive, down there. Pruell went to Dodge City last week, Reston said from horseback. Bodie has a cousin who works at the Delmonico Hotel. Been there 20 years. Knows every regular who comes through. Pruell met with 3 men in a private dining room. Railroad men, or men presenting themselves as railroad men. And a 4th man she kept hoeing, Judge Aldgate. She said not a question. Reston was quiet for a moment. Yes, now she stopped, turned, looked at him fully. He's going to challenge the cease, she said. The legal opinion is already written, Reston said. Bodie's cousin got close enough to hear pieces of it. Aldgate has prepared a finding that the notarization on our contract didn't meet full territorial requirements. It's a technical argument, thin enough that most judges would dismiss it in an afternoon. But Aldgate is the judge. She set the hoe against the garden wall, stood with her hands at her sides, thought it through, the full shape of it. A lease declared void, her water rights unprotected. Pruell making his next move without the obstacle of Calip's calm on the paperwork. A woman alone with a contested claim and a judge already bought and paid for. She thought through all of it, felt the weight of it settle. Then she thought through what she had, her land certificate. 5 years of proof under the Homestead Act. The lease properly executed. The water reports, every one of them, documented in her ledger with dates and measurements, and observations that built a record no one could argue with. Her father's knowledge of the subsurface geology, which she had been writing down, slowly, carefully, in a separate section of the ledger for 2 years, because she had understood that knowledge kept only in a living person was fragile. People died. She knew that better than most. She thought about Silas Wren. I need to go to Cedar Falls, she said. When? Tomorrow morning I'll ride with you. She looked at him. Why? Because Pruell's men cut your fence at night, he said. And because the road to Cedar Falls goes through 12 miles of county I own. And because he stopped, tried again. Because you have the right to make this trip without looking over your shoulder the whole way. She studied him. The same assessment, the same measuring. You'll ride behind me, she said. Not beside. Why? Because I'm the one who knows where we're going. Something moved through his expression. Quick, there and gone. Fair enough, he said. Silas Wren's office in Cedar Falls was small and dark, and smelled of old paper and lamp oil and decades of careful work. Silas himself was 61 years old and had been the county land records clerk since 1850. Since before Kansas was a state. Since before the Homestead Act existed. He had sat in this room and recorded every deed, every transfer, every sale, every dispute, every handshake turned into paper in Cimarron County for 28 years. He was small and thin, and moved with the economy of someone who had learned long ago that unnecessary motion was wasted effort. He listened to Saya lay out the situation. All of it, Pruell's visits. The letter with the railroad claim, the cut fence, the meeting in Dodge City. Aldgate's legal opinion already written. Waiting to be deployed, Silas listened without interrupting, without taking notes, without showing anything on his face, except the attentiveness of someone who was filing everything away in a system they'd been using for 28 years and trusted completely. When she finished, he was quiet. The clock on the wall behind him ticked. Outside, Cedar Falls made its small-town sounds, a wagon on the main street, someone calling across to someone else. The ordinary sounds of a place that didn't yet know what was happening inside it. Silas stood up. He went to the corner of the office, to a cabinet that was separate from the main filing system. Darker wood, smaller, with a key lock he carried on his watch chain. He took the key out, opened the cabinet inside, a wooden box. Deep, full. He lifted it out and set it on the table between them. "I've been waiting 28 years for someone to sit in that chair with what you just told me," he said. He opened the box. Inside, paper. Dozens of documents, maybe more than dozens, filed carefully, dated, cross-referenced in a system that mirrored his official filing system, but existed entirely outside it. Private, separate, maintained by one man alone for nearly 3 decades. "Every transaction in this county that showed the pattern you're describing," Silas said. "Price too high relative to conditions. Seller in distress. Approval timeline that didn't match the standard process. I made copies, kept them here." Say looked at the box. "For 28 years, she said. "For 28 years, why?" Silas sat back down, looked at his hands for a moment. "My father lost land in Missouri in 1849, he said. I was 12. I watched how it happened. A man came with documents and a smile and a timeline, and my father didn't understand all of it, and signed something that meant something different than what he was told it meant. He looked up. We left Missouri with nothing. My father worked himself to death on nothing else's land because he had no land of his own anymore. I came to Kansas, and I took this job, and I decided I was going to write down everything, every single thing, so that if it happened again in my county, someone would have what my father didn't have." A long silence. Saya said. "Evidence," Silas said. "Pruell has done the fell 11 times in 2 years. Aldgate has signed 7 of those approvals. I have copies of all of it." He looked at her. "But I can't use them. A clerk can't bring a case, can't stand up in front of the county board and present evidence. I can only give these to someone who can stand up." He waited. "Can you stand up?" he asked. Saya looked at the box, thought about her father's hands pressing flat against the southwest valley floor, about the 3 sisters' garden holding moisture through 3 years of drought while everything around it failed, about the certificate on her wall and its cracked frame, about five years of sweeping the yard before sunrise because the yard needed sweeping, regardless of who noticed. "Yes," she said. They rode back in the afternoon light, Retton behind her. As agreed. She was quiet for the first few miles, processing, organizing, putting each piece in the right place before moving to the next one, the way she organized everything, methodically, without rushing. Because rushing led to placing things wrong, and placing things wrong led to gaps, and gaps were how you lost. Retton let her be quiet. That was something she'd noticed about him over these weeks. He didn't fill silence because he was uncomfortable with it. He let silence be what it was, a space where thinking could happen without interference. Not many men did that. "There's something you should know," he said finally, when they were 4 miles from the ranch. She looked back at him over her shoulder. "Pruell contacted me," he said, 3 weeks ago, before the fence was cut. He sent a rider with a letter. She waited. He offered to buy the lease from me. Said he'd pay me 3 times its value if I transferred the water rights and walked away from the arrangement. Clean transaction. No complications. The horses moved. The cold air moved. "I didn't tell you," he said. "I should have. I turned him down immediately, and I told myself it wasn't important because I'd already refused. But you had a right to know he'd approached me, and I didn't tell you." She looked at him for a long moment, read his face the way she read ground, the way she read weather, looking for what was underneath the surface. The thing that the surface expression was built on top of. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I didn't want you to wonder whether I'd considered it. Had you?" "No, not for a moment." "Not for a moment." She looked forward again. The trail, the cold afternoon, the land she knew by feel, and the land beyond that she knew by description, and the land beyond that she knew only by what came from it. The wind direction, the cloud formation, the way sound moved differently, depending on what the earth beneath was doing. "I believe you," she said. "You do? You rode behind me for 12 miles to Cedar Falls," she said. A man who was considering Pruell's offer doesn't ride behind. Silence. That's your measure of a man, he said. Where he rides. Among other things, she felt him deciding whether to say the next thing. He said it. What are the other things? Whether he tells you the truth when it costs him something to tell it, she said. Whether his crew works with people or over them. Whether he adds a drainage clause to a contract that only benefits the other party. The trail curved. She took the curve first, and whether he signs a termination clause he didn't have to sign, she added. Without arguing about it, behind her, quiet. You noticed all of that, he said. I notice everything, she said. You should know that by now. The ranch appeared at the end of the trail as it always did. The dead cottonwoods first. Then the bleached house, then the barn, with its new roof catching the last of the afternoon light differently than the old one had. Same land. Different light on it. She unsaddled her horse in the barn, and Rustan unsaddled his beside her, and they worked in the quiet rhythm that had developed between them over these weeks. Not needing to coordinate. Not needing to explain. Just each doing what needed doing and trusting the other to do the same. When the horses were settled, she went to the kitchen table and opened the ledger. Breton sat across from her without being asked. She wrote the date, wrote what Silas Wren had told them, the box of documents, the 28 years of parallel records, the 11 transactions, the 7 Aldgate approvals, the pattern written out in her hand, specific and dated and cross-referenced. Breton watched her write. You write everything down, he said. I write down everything that happened, and everything I understood from what happened, she said. There's a difference. Facts are what occurred. Understanding is what the facts mean. Both need to be recorded because the people who want to take something from you will challenge both, she finished the entry. Read it back. Added one clarification to its date. Silas Wren has been writing things down for 28 years, she said, because his father lost everything and nobody had written anything down. She looked at the ledger. We write things down so that the people who come after us don't have to lose what we lost just to learn what we learned. Reston was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me between now and the board meeting? He said. Your survey maps from when you bought the eastern section, she said. Whatever you have on the surface formation. And your presence, not your intervention, your presence. There's a difference. I know the difference, he said. She looked at him. I'm beginning to think you do, she said. They were 4 days out from Cedar Falls when Pruell made his third move. The letter arrived on a Monday. Different from the first one in every way that mattered. Shorter, no architecture of politeness, no railroad surveys, no sincere hopes, just the threat stated plainly enough that it couldn't be misread. Miss Saya, my offer of $5,800 expires Friday. After that date, I cannot guarantee the conditions under which this matter will be resolved. Cimarron County is a long way from any law office that might take an interest in a disputed claim. She read it once, set it down, picked up her pen, wrote in the ledger, November 26. Explicit threat. Cannot guarantee conditions. Long way from any law office. He is no longer trying to buy. He is trying to frighten. This is no longer about the offer. This is about whether he believes I will break. She underlined the last line, then wrote underneath it, he has miscalculated. She sent word to Reston, not asking for anything, giving him information. The way she always did, because information was something you shared with the people who had a stake in what it meant. Not something you hoarded, until it was too late to be useful. He arrived the next evening. Alone this time, just him. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table. She put Pruell's letter between them without comment. He read it. His expression didn't change dramatically. But something in the set of his jaw changed. Something in the way he set the letter back on the table, not dropping it, placing it. The deliberate care of a man who was angry and had decided what to do with the anger before it could do something unhelpful. He's done this before, Reston said. This exact letter. Bodie tracked down the Halverson widow. She sold last year, still lives in the county, 2 miles east of Cedar Falls. He found a copy of the letter she received, nearly word for word. She was alone, Saya said. Yes. I'm alone. You're not, Reston said. She looked at him. I'm saying that as a fact, he said, not as an offer to take over. You have a lease partner whose interests align with yours. You have evidence from Silas Wren. You have knowledge of this land that no one else in this county has. You are not alone in this, but the decision is mine, she said. The decision is yours, he said, completely. She looked at the letter on the table between them, thought about the Halverson widow, who had been alone, who had sold, who was still in the county 2 miles east of Cedar Falls, probably doing the calculation every morning of what she'd had and what she had now, and what the difference between those two numbers cost her. I'm not selling, Saya said. I know, he said. I need your men Friday, visible. Same position as last time, done, and I need Bodie to send word to the county sheriff in Cedar Falls. Not to come, just to know. So there's a record that we informed him. Done, she nodded. Picked up the letter, folded it, put it in the ledger between the pages she'd need for the board meeting. Evidence. Everything was evidence. There's something else, she said. Retton waited. When Pruell comes Friday, I'm going to tell him something true that I haven't told anyone outside of you and Silas Wren. What? About the water, where it comes from, what it connects to, how much of it there is. In front of your men and whatever men he brings. Reston looked at her carefully. If y'all say that in front of witnesses, he said slowly, it becomes public. The consortium will know exactly what they're dealing with. They might want it more. They might, she said. Or every rancher in this county will understand what's at stake. And when every rancher understands what's at stake, Pruell can't move quietly anymore. She set her hands flat on the table. Quiet is his method. Everything he does depends on people not knowing what they have, or not knowing what he's taking. Take away the quiet, and what does he have? Letters that threaten women who live far from law offices. That's all. The lantern between them burned steady. The creek ran beyond the window, quiet in the cold night. Knowledge shared can't be stolen, she said. My father taught me that. A secret someone else knows about you is a weapon they can use. The same thing spoken publicly in front of witnesses is just the truth. And you can't steal the truth. You can only try to bury it. And burying it requires silence. And we're about to take the silence away. Reston sat with that for a long time. That's a risk, he said. Everything is a risk, she said. I'm choosing which risk I want. Friday arrived. The sky the same hard blue it had been the last time. Cold air so clear you could see the far ridge of the county line without effort. Pruell came with 3 riders this time, not 2, 3. And these 3 weren't the clean-cut variety from November 8th. These were rougher, quieter. The kind of men who had a different relationship with what was being asked of them. Men who had been hired not to look impressive, but to be available for whatever came next. He pulled up at the south fence line, where Reston stood with 4 men, and Saya, 6 feet to Reston's left. The Colt on her hip, her hands loose at her sides, the ledger tucked under her left arm, visible, deliberate, not a weapon, a record. The difference between those two things was everything. Pruell took in the scene, took in the extra men, the ledger under her arm. The particular stillness of people who had decided and were not deciding anymore. Miss Saya, he said, I hoped we might resolve this today. We will, she said. He waited for her to continue with an offer or a concession or a question. The conversational moves he expected. She didn't make them instead. This land sits above a subsurface water feed that runs from the northern table formation through to the Cimarron River system, she said. Her voice carried across the cold field the way it always carried, not loud, just clear. It has been running for longer than this county has existed. My father documented it. His father documented it before him. I have documented it for 5 years. The creek behind this property is the surface expression of a system that provides water to a 20-mile radius. Pruell's expression shifted. Barely, But it shifted. That feed doesn't care about property lines, she said. It doesn't care who owns the surface above it. But the surface above it, this surface, these 320 acres, is the point where it's accessible, where it can be managed, where it can be protected. A pause. Just long enough. Every rancher in this county has a stake in what happens to this land, because what happens to this water source happens to all of them, and I intend to make that known, publicly, with documentation, in Cedar Falls. At the county board meeting in December, silence. Total silence except for the wind and the creek. One of Pruell's three riders exchanged a look with the rider beside him, a quick look, but visible. The look of men reassessing what they'd agreed to be part of. Pruell sat very still on his horse. The practiced stillness of a man performing calm while doing rapid calculation behind it. My offer, he started, is declined, Saya said. It was declined the first time, the second time, the third time. It is declined now, in daylight, in front of witnesses, with full understanding of what you represent and what methods you use. She held his gaze. The next time you come onto this property without invitation, I will have the county sheriff here to meet you, and I will have the county board's correspondence with your consortium's horse legal counsel, which Mr. Silas Wren has been documenting for 28 years. That is not a threat. That is information. You are welcome to do with it what you like, Pruell. Looked at Reston for a long moment, looking for the crack. The hesitation, the signal that Callum could be separated from the woman standing 6 feet to his left. Reston gave him nothing to work with. Pruell touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, rode, his 3 riders followed. The last one, the one who'd exchanged the look, turned back once before he crested the trail line, looked at Saya. Something in his face that wasn't admiration exactly, but was in the neighborhood of it. Then he was gone. Nobody spoke for a moment. The cold field. The sky. The creek, then Bodie said, very quietly. Behind Reston's shoulder, she just made this county wide. Reston looked at Saya. She was already walking back to the house. Same pace, as always. Forward, steady. The pace of someone who had more work to do and was moving toward it. At the porch step, she paused. Didn't turn around. There will be a count board meeting December 14th, she said. Cedar Falls. I need to present the water documentation. All of it. I'll be there, Reston said. I know, she said, and went inside. That night she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, ledger open, lantern burning. The house quiet around her, and the creek quieter still in the cold beyond the window. She wrote, November 30. Second confrontation at South Fence. Pruell brought 3 men. He left without paperwork, without argument, without anything except the information I gave him. She paused. He knows now that I know what they want. He will change methods again. He has not run out of options yet. The question is how much time we have before the county board meeting. She looked at the window. Dark outside. 14 days, she wrote. 14 days to build a case that holds in a room full of men who have heard everything before. She closed the ledger, looked at the certificate on the wall. Her name, still there. She thought about the Halverson widow, who had sold, who had maybe not had anyone who said the decision is yours, who had maybe not had 28 years of someone else's careful documentation waiting for her, who had maybe just been alone, in a way, that Sai, despite, was not quite. She blew out the lantern, sat in the dark hawk for a moment. The creek outside, still running, still finding its way. 14 days, she thought. Not long. But enough. She picked up the ledger and went to bed, because 14 days was not very long. And the work started tomorrow. 14 days. That was what she had. 14 days between the second confrontation at the South Fence and the county board meeting in Cedar Falls. 14 days to build something solid enough to stand up in front of 5 men who had heard everything before and been moved by very little of it. 14 days wasn't long, but it was what she had. So she used every hour of it. She started the morning after Pruell rode away. December 1st, before sunrise. before the frost had decided what it was going to do with the day. She went to the section of the ledger she'd been building for 2 years, the section that wasn't accounting, wasn't water measurements, wasn't the daily record of what the ranch needed and what it got. This section was her father's knowledge, written down slowly, carefully, in both Apache and English, side by side, because she'd understood early that translation always lost something, and she wanted both versions preserved. The subsurface grade in the Southwest Valley, the entry point of the underground feed, the way the water moved seasonally, faster in spring, slower in the dry months, but never stopping, because the formation that held it was deep enough to stay below the frost line and wide, enough to maintain pressure, even through 3 years of drought. She had been writing it down for 2 years. Because knowledge that lived only in a person was fragile, because people died, she spread the pages out on the kitchen table. All of them, 12 pages of careful documentation, diagrams drawn in the margins, reference points marked by landmarks she could name and walk to and stand on, cross-references to surface features that anyone with eyes could verify. Then she started translating, not from Apache to English. She'd already done that. From her knowledge into language that a county board could follow, into terms that matched the geological vocabulary she'd taught herself from 2 books she'd found in Cedar Falls, one from a university manual, one a survey years manual from 1869. She'd read both of them twice, taken notes in the margins, cross-referenced their terminology against what her father had taught her, and found that the words were different, but the things they described were the same things, the same earth, the same water, the same relationships between them. She wasn't a geologist, but she knew this land better than any geologist who had ever walked across it, and she could prove it. She worked at the table until the light outside changed from black to gray to the thin pale gold of a December morning, made coffee, kept working. By midday, she had translated 9 of the 12 pages. By evening, she had all 12, plus a summary document that laid out the key findings in plain language, the subsurface grade, the feed entry point, the seasonal flow patterns, the surface expressions of the underground system, and their locations, verifiable by anyone willing to ride to them. She read the summary document 3 times. Found 2 places where she'd been imprecise, fixed them. Found 1 place where she'd been more certain than the evidence warranted. Softened it to reflect what she actually knew versus what she inferred, because overstatement was something they could attack. Precision was something they couldn't. She wrote at the top of the summary, "The following is a documentation of knowledge accumulated over 3 generations of continuous observation of the Marin County Eastern Water System, beginning with the work of my grandfather, continued by my father, and maintained by myself for the past 5 years. 3 generations, not just her. Not just her father, her grandfather, who had learned the land before there was a Kansas Territory to put a name to it, who had pressed his own palm to the Southwest Valley floor and understood what he felt there, who had passed that understanding forward to her. Father, who had passed it to her. 3 generations of attention to 1 piece of earth. Against that, what did Pruell have? Documents that said he should own something. She had documents that said she understood it. Those were not the same thing. Reston came on December 3rd. Not announced, not summoned. He knocked. She noticed that. He'd never knocked before. The first morning he'd stood at the threshold and waited. After that he'd come when invited or when he had something she needed to know. But a knock, waiting at the door until she chose to open it, that was different. That was a person who had thought about what he was doing and decided to do it differently than he had before. She opened the door. He had a roll of paper under his arm. "Survey maps," he said. "From when I bought the eastern section in '71. They're not precise. The survey was done quickly and the surveyor was better at billing than measuring. But they show the surface formation as it was recorded then. I thought they might help." She looked at the roll of paper, looked at him. "Come in," she said. They spent 4 hours at the kitchen table, his maps and her documentation spread out together across every inch of the surface, weighted at the corners, with the inkwell and the coffee cup, and 2 river stones. She kept on the windowsill because they were from the creek, and the creek was what this was all about. His surface formation data and her subsurface knowledge laid over each other, like two languages describing the same thing from different directions. Where his surveys showed a slight depression in the eastern field, noted by the surveyor as a drainage irregularity, meaning he'd seen it and not known what it meant, her documentation explained why. The underground feed passed closest to the surface. There, the soil above it had a different composition as a result, held moisture differently, behaved differently in freeze and thaw. Where his cattle had always grazed heaviest in the southeast corner, he mentioned this, not thinking it was significant, just conversation. She pointed to her documentation and showed him why. The moisture level in the grass was measurably higher there. The underground feed ran within 15 feet of the surface at that point. The cattle knew. Animals always knew where the water was, even when it wasn't visible. He looked at the diagram she'd drawn of the underground system. Looked at it for a long time. "Your father drew this? He taught it to me. I drew it." "When?" "When I was 12. On the ground, with a stick. He made me draw it from memory after he showed me. Then again, 3 days later. Then again a month after that. He said if I could draw it the same way from memory. I knew it, could you?" "Yes," she said. "I could draw it right now without looking at the page." He looked at the diagram, at the 12 pages of documentation, at the 2 worn books with her notes in the margins, the university press text, and the surveyor's manual, their terminologies bridged by her careful handwriting throughout. "This is the case," he said. "Yes. Pruell doesn't have anything like this." "No," she said. "He has documents that say he should own something." "I have documents that say I understand it." Something moved through his expression. The look that came when she said something he hadn't anticipated. It came more often now than it had in October, which told her something about the distance between what he'd expected when he first rode onto this land and what he'd found. "Those aren't the same thing," he said. "No," she said, "they're not. And in front of a county board, the difference matters. Anyone can buy a document. You can't buy 3 generations of observation." He unrolled his survey maps fully and smoothed them flat. "Show me where your data overlaps with mine," he said. "I want to understand it well enough to answer questions about it if they ask me." She looked at him. "They'll ask me," she said. "They might ask both of us," he said. "And I'd rather understand it than not." She looked at the maps. Then she began to explain. Slowly. The way her father had explained to her, not talking down, not simplifying past accuracy, but finding the words that carried the actual meaning to someone who hadn't spent a lifetime with this particular ground. He listened the way Bodhi listened at the fence line, without interrupting, without rushing to the next question before he'd finished processing the answer to the last one. 2 hours later, he could read her documentation on his own. Not perfectly, not with the depth she had, but well enough to follow the argument, well enough to verify the cross-references, well enough to know if someone in that room tried to misrepresent what it said. "Your grandfather," he said when they were nearly done. "He mapped this before there was a Kansas territory, before it had that name," she said. "The land was the same land, and the knowledge came to you through him. Through your father. Yes. That's 3 generations of continuous record," he said. "Yes, no one in that county boardroom is going to have a counter-argument to 3 generations of continuous record," he said. "They might have objections. They might have political reasons to hesitate. But they won't have a counter-argument. Because there isn't one." She rolled the summary document carefully and set it with the others. "That's what I'm counting on," she said. On December 5th, Pruell made his last move, not at the ranch, not in person. He went to Judge Aldgate, and Aldgate issued a preliminary injunction. The paperwork arrived by county courier on a gray Tuesday morning. An official document, territorial seal, Aldgate's signature, in the careful hand of a man who had learned that his signature carried weight and had decided at some point to put that weight in the wrong service. Pending review of the lease agreement between one Reston Callum and the claimant known as Saya, dated October 1878, the water access rights described therein are hereby suspended until such time as the court can verify the validity of said agreement under territorial law. She read it standing at the door, read it again, set it on the kitchen table, sat down. The injunction didn't take her land, didn't invalidate her deed, didn't do the thing she'd been guarding against most directly. It did something more precise. It suspended the lease, which suspended Reston's cattle movement, which suspended her lease income, which Pruell had calculated correctly was the financial thread holding the winter together. No lease income meant no feed reserves for spring. No feed reserves meant no cattle of her own come planting season. No cattle meant the land produced nothing. And land that produced nothing, held by a woman alone in a drought year, with legal challenges pending, that was land that eventually had to be sold. He hadn't taken her land. He'd removed the thing supporting it. The way you didn't cut down a tree. You cut what the tree was rooted in and waited for the tree to fall on its own. Elegant. Wrong. But elegant. She sat at the table for exactly as long as it took to understand the full shape of what had happened. Then she stood up, got the ledger. Wrote, December 5, Aldgate Nation, lease suspended pending review. Pruell's method, remove the financial foundation, not the land itself. She looked at what she'd written, a dead. 9 days until the county board meeting. The injunction is the argument. Silas Wren's documentation is the counterargument. My water knowledge is the foundation of both. He did one more line. He has made a mistake. He has something to bring to the board that I didn't have before. Proof that Aldgate is acting on behalf of a private interest. A judge who issues an injunction benefiting Pruell's consortium 2 weeks before Pruell's offer expires is not exercising judicial discretion. He is a tool being used. And now I have the tool's fingerprints on the paperwork. She closed the ledger, sent word to Reston, sent word to Silas Wren, then went back to the kitchen table and kept working on the documentation. Because 9 days was still 9 days, and the case still needed building, regardless of what Pruell did to try to stop it. Reston arrived that evening. He sat down across from her, looked at the injunction on the table between them. Aldgate can't do this, he said. He did it, she said. The notarization was properly executed. Silas Wren witnessed it himself. I know then. Reston, he stopped. She looked at him steadily. He knows it won't hold, she said. That's not the point. The point is that while it's being argued the lease is suspended, he doesn't need the injunction to be permanent. He needs it to last 9 days. Reston looked at the document, understood. He's removing time, he said. Yes, she said. There's a difference between buying time and removing it. He's removing ours. The lantern between them burned. Can you make it 9 days without the lease income? He said. She looked at him. That's not your question to ask. It is if I'm your lease partner, and the lease is what put you in this position. A silence. Yes, she said, finally, I can make it 9 days. Certain, I have been making it alone for 2 years. I can make it 9 days. He nodded slowly. Then we go to Cedar Falls on the 14th, he said. And we bring everything. Yes, she said. You come with me. That expression again. Quick and warm and gone. Yes, he said. There is, the last night before the board meeting, Pruell came, alone. No riders, no performance. Just him on the roan in the cold dark. Pulling up at the gate at 7 in the evening like a man who had run out of other options, and knew it, and had come anyway, because the alternative was admitting it. She heard the horse from inside, took the colt from the table, didn't put it on her hip, held it at her side, opened the door. He was still mounted, hadn't dismounted. She understood why. Staying on the horse meant he could leave fast. Part of him already knew this wasn't going to go the way he needed Miss Saya. I wanted to speak with you privately before tomorrow. We have nothing private to discuss, she said. Everything between us has witnesses, even when there's no one else present. I've been writing it all down. $3,000, he said. She said, nothing, $3,000, and I will have the injunction withdrawn by morning. You keep the lease. You keep the land. You walk away with enough to run this ranch properly for 5 years. She looked at him, really looked at the horse, the cold, the dark sky behind him with its hard winter stars. The man on the horse, who had spent 2 months trying to take what she had through legal maneuvering and intimidation and financial strangulation, and had now arrived alone in the dark with the number 3,000, because everything else had failed, and he knew it had failed. You're afraid, she said. He didn't answer. You found out about Seatless Wren's documentation. Someone in Cedar Falls told you, or you worked it out from the fact that I've been to his office twice. And now you know what's going to be on that table tomorrow, and you know what it means for you. Still nothing. Find somewhere else, she said. Start over with someone who doesn't know what I know and hasn't been building what I've been building. That's the only advice I have for you. 3,000 is a number that tells me how worried you are, she said. And it tells me everything I need to know about tomorrow. She looked at him one last time. Don't come onto this property again, and closed the door. She stood behind it. Heard him sit there on the horse in the dark. Heard him finally, slowly turn the animal. Heard the hoofbeats fade north. She set the colt on the table, opened the ledger. December 13, Pruell came alone, after dark. Offered $3,000 and injunction withdrawal. He knows what Silas Wren has. He is trying to buy his way out of tomorrow. She looked at the number. $3,000 is what fear costs when you've run out of other methods, she wrote. He should have left in October. He didn't. Tomorrow is the result of that decision. She closed the ledger, laid out everything she needed for the morning. The 12 pages of water documentation, the geoshotic she'd built from the 2 survey books, the ledger with every visit, every letter, every threat, recorded, dated, quoted, Reston's survey maps, rolled and tied, all of it in order, all of it ready. She looked at the certificate on the wall, Saya, Homestead Act 1862, Cimarron County, Kansas Territory, granted 1873. Tomorrow, she thought, she lay down with her coat on instead of her boots this time. Because she'd learned over these weeks that there was a difference between readiness and exhaustion, and tomorrow required the first, and couldn't afford the second. She slept. The county board meeting was held in the Cedar Falls Assembly Hall, a long room. Pine floors worn smooth by years of use. 4 windows, along the west wall letting in the thin December light, the kind of light that illuminated without warming. 5 men at the board table, elected representatives of Cimarron County's districts. Men who had their own land and their own debts and their own understanding of how the world worked and who had power over what. The room was fuller than usual. Word had traveled. The way word always traveled in a county this size. Fast, and not entirely accurately, but in the right direction. But people who lived close to the ground noticed uncommon things, and a woman holding off a land sit consortium, while a territorial judge issued injunctions on private behalf, was uncommon enough that people made the ride to Cedar Falls to see what happened next. Ranchers, their wives, 2 men from the Cedar Falls land office, who had their own reasons to be interested. A reporter from the county paper, who wrote in a small notebook with the focused expression of someone who understood they were watching something worth recording. And in the back row, quiet as she'd always been quiet, the Halverson widow. Saya saw her when she came in, didn't acknowledge her, didn't need to. Just noted she was there, and understood what it meant that she'd made the ride. Saya walked in with Reston behind her, not beside. Behind, as agreed, she carried the ledger and the documentation. In the canvased bag she'd made herself 8 years ago from material her mother had given her. The bag had carried seed packets and water samples and accounting records. Now this. The same bag. Different weight. He's seated at the front. Retton sat 2 rows back. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where he was. The board convened at 10. The chairman, a heavyset man named Burris, with a white beard and reading glasses, he kept removing and replacing, as though they were the problem, called the session to order. Read the agenda. The injunction matter was third on the list. She waded through items 1 and 2, didn't fidget, didn't look around the room. Read her documentation one more time. The pages. She'd read so many times she could have recited them without looking, but read again, anyway, because precision required practice, and she would not be imprecise today. When Burris called item 3, he read it carefully. The matter of the preliminary injunction issued by Judge Aldgate regarding the lease agreement between Reston Callum and the claimant Saya, and the associated water access dispute in the eastern Cimarron district. He looked up. Is the claimant present? Yes, Sayas, said. She stood. I'm here. The room shifted. Slightly. The particular shift of a room that has been told something is coming, and now sees it arrive. You may present, Barricas said. She walked to the front, set the canvas bag on the table, looked at the 5 men looking at her. And then she began. She didn't start with Pruell, she started with water. Cimarron County has been in drought for 3 years, she said. Most of you know that from your own land. You've watched your wells drop and your creeks go quiet, and your cattle move to wherever the water still is. She paused. The water still is, in part, 6 Kiesel, because of a subsurface feed that enters the county formation from the northern table and moves south through an underground system that surfaces at several points in the eastern district. The most significant surface expression of that system is the creek running through my property. She took out the first pages of documentation, set them on the board table where the 5 men could see. I have been documenting this system for 5 years. My father documented it before me, his father before him. This knowledge comes from 3 generations of continuous observation of this specific land, beginning before Kansas Territory existed as a legal designation. One of the board members younger than the others. Sharp-eyed, the kind of man who leaned forward when something interested him. Leaned forward. What kind of documentation? He said. Written, she said. Dated. Cross-referenced against surface formations that you can walk to and verify in an afternoon. The subsurface grade in the Southwest Valley runs north to south at approximately 8 degrees. I can show you where to stand to feel it under your feet. The feed enters the system here. She pointed to her diagram, and surfaces here, here, and here. The primary surface point is my creek. She looked at him directly. The proposed railroad route that Mr. Pruell's consortium has cited as the reason for acquiring my land runs through the Southwest Valley. That route is not viable. The subsurface grade makes foundation costs prohibitive, approximately 3 times higher than the alternative route 10 miles north. Any survey conducted honestly would show this within half a day. Silence, which means the railroad route is not the actual reason my land is being targeted. More silence. The actual reason, she said, is the water. The room was very quiet. She laid out the rest of it clearly and without the repeater. The 20-mile radius served by the underground system. The drought conditions that made that system the difference between ranches that survived and ranches that didn't. The surface ownership of her 320 acres as the controlling factor for access to the system's primary point. Then she set Reston's survey maps on the table beside her. Documentation. These are survey maps from 1871, covering the eastern section of Cimarron County. They were conducted independently, for a different purpose, by a different party. They show the same surface formations my documentation references. The correlation is exact. The sharp-eyed board member looked at the maps, looked at her documentation, looked at the maps again. These were set 7 years apart. He said, yes, she said, by different people, for different reasons. They described the same ground. Then, Silas Wren stood up. From the back of the room where he'd been sitting so quietly that most people hadn't noticed he was there. Small, thin, carrying his box under one arm with the careful grip of someone transporting something irreplaceable. He walked to the front, set the box on the table beside Saya's documentation. "My name is Silas Wren," he said. "I have been the land records clerk for Cimarron County since 1850. I have something to present to this board." He opened the box, and he began to read, not fast, not slow. The way he did everything, with the economy of someone who had spent 28 years making sure every word was in the right place before committing to paper. November 1876. The Halverson property, 240 acres, Eastern District, sold to an agent representing a Dodge City investment group for $900. Standard review period, 30 days. Actual review period, 4 days. Approving authority, Judge Aldgate. He read the second, March 1877. The Drummond Homestead, 160 acres, South District, sold under duress following 2 incidents of fence destruction attributed to unknown parties. $650. Review period, 3 days. Approving authority, Judge Aldgate. He read the third, and the fourth, and by the fifth the room was so quiet. You could hear the December wind, finding the gaps in the assembly hall windows. The small, cold whistles of air moving through places that weren't quite sealed. 7 transactions, total 7 approvals by Aldgate, each with review periods that didn't meet the territorial standard, each following the same pattern of approach and pressure and eventual sale, each involving the same network of buyers that traced back, through 2 layers of company names, to the same Dodge City investment consortium that Denton Pruell represented. Burris had taken off his reading glasses and was not putting them back on. The sharp-eyed younger board member had stopped writing and was simply listening, the pen still in his hand, forgotten. "Mr. Wren," Burris said, when Silas finished, "how long have you had these records?" 28 years, Silas said. "I have been maintaining parallel documentation since 1850. Every transaction that showed an irregular pattern. I kept copies in a separate location. Why?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "Because I watched my father lose land in Missouri when I was 12 years old," he said. "And nobody had written anything down." The room received that. "Let it sit." Burris looked at at Silas, at the documentation spread across the board table. "At the box, is Judge Aldgate present today?" he said. A county aide went to look. He was not. He had not been in Cedar Falls since December 5th. The day the injunction was issued, the board deliberated for 40 minutes. Saya sat in the front row and waited. She was good at waiting. She'd had practice, 5 years of it, of holding something that needed holding while conditions slowly shifted around it, without losing your grip in the meantime. Retton sat 2 rows behind her. She could feel him there without looking. The particular quality of his presence. Steady, not performing steadiness, actually steady. The way someone was steady when decided what they were going to do and were waiting to do it. At one point, the board asked her 3 follow-up questions through a representative. She answered each one directly. No elaboration beyond what was asked. No performance. Just the accurate answer in the fewest words that carried it completely. After 40 minutes, Burris called the session back. "This board finds the injunction issued by Judge Aldgate to be procedurally irregular and substantively unsupported," he said. "The injunction is hereby vacated. The lease agreement between Reston Calaman and the claimant Saya is reinstated as originally executed, effective immediately." He looked at his reading glasses. "Put them on." This board further finds that the pattern of irregular approvals, documented by Mr. Wren, 1 warrants formal referral to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review of Judge Aldgate's conduct. That referral will be submitted by the end of this week. He looked up at the room. "This session is adjourned." The room let out a sound. Not loud, not celebratory. The collective exhale of people who had been holding something in and were now releasing it. The sound of a room that had been watching something tightly wound and was watching it come unwound in the right direction. People stood. The reporter was still writing. The sharp-eyed board member was crossing the room toward Silas Wren with his hand extended. The two men from the land office were talking to each other in low voices. Heads together, the conversation of people recalibrating. Saya stood, packed her documentation back into the canvas bag. Careful, methodical. The same way she packed everything. When she turned, 3 people were waiting to speak with her. 2 ranchers from the Eastern District, their faces carrying the expression of people who had been watching from a distance and had just understood something they'd been trying to understand for a long time. And the third, a woman, older than Saya, a widow's posture, a kind of watchfulness in her eyes that came from having learned the hard way to watch, the Halverson widow, still in the county. Still here, I didn't know anyone had documentation, she said quietly, when they came to me. I didn't know there was anything to fight with. I know, Saya said. I signed because I thought I had no choice. I know. The woman looked at her. Was there anything that could have? I don't know, Saya said. Honestly, I don't know what would have been different. Maybe something, maybe nothing. What I know is that the documentation exists now. More people know about it now. The next time someone tries this in this county, it will be harder. That doesn't give you back what you lost, but it means someone else won't lose it the same way. The woman was quiet. Thank you, she said finally. For standing up, you would have, Saya said. If you'd had what I had. The woman thought about that for a moment. Yes, she said. I think I would have. Outside, the December air was cold and exact, the kind of cold that clarified things rather than confusing them. Retton was waiting on the steps, not in front of the door. To the side, letting the people coming out pass without having to navigate around him. Positioned the way. Someone was positioned when they were waiting, without making the waiting into a statement about themselves. She came out. Stopped beside him. They stood for a moment in the cold. Silas Wren had that box for 28 years, Reston said. Yes, waiting for someone who came in with enough to make it usable. Yes, you were that person. She looked at him. We were, she said. Your survey maps, Silas's documentation, my water knowledge. None of it was sufficient alone. All of it together was more than sufficient. Yours was the foundation. The foundation isn't the whole structure, she said. It's what the structure is built on. Both things are true at the same time. He looked at the street, at Cedar Falls going about its December business, ordinary and unhurried, unaware of what had just happened inside the assembly hall. Or aware in the way small towns were always aware before anyone had been officially told. What happens now, he said. Aldgate will be removed. Pruell will move on. Find a different county, a different approach, different targets. The consortium will redirect, and your land? My land is my land. It was before today. It still is. The lease reinstated. Your cattle can cross the East Creek again. I'll have the December water report to Cedar Falls by the 15th. That's not. He started. Reston. He stopped. She turned and looked at him fully. What are you trying to ask? She said. He looked at her. The same steadiness he'd brought to everything from the first morning, not performed, actual. The steadiness of a man who had been paying attention to something and had decided what it meant. I want to ask whether the arrangement between us might take a different form, he said. Something more permanent than a lease, the street noise, the cold, the December sky, very blue and very high above Cedar Falls. You're talking about more than the lease, she said. Yes, she didn't answer. Not immediately, because this was not a question you answered. Immediately. This was a question you took home and turned over and looked at from every side. The way you looked at a contract or a fence line or a section of ground that might or might not be solid beneath the surface. The way you looked at anything that mattered. Ask me again in 3 days, she said. He nodded. 3 days, he said. She rode home alone. Radden offered. She declined. Not sharply, just no. She needed the 12 miles of trail to herself, needed to think without anyone else's presence affecting the thinking, needed the land and the sound of her horse, and the particular quality of attention that came from having nothing else to do but consider. The land moved past her. The cold, flat stretch of Cimarron County in December, gray and brown and enormous under the sky. She knew every mile of this trail, had ridden it in summer heat and spring mud and winter ice, alone for 2 years since her husband died, before that with him. For that, learning it from her father in the years when the world was still the size of what one person could teach another. She thought about her father, about the day he'd pressed his palm to the Southwest Valley floor and asked her what she felt, about his voice, not dramatic, not sentimental, just factual, saying, "This is how our people fed themselves when nothing else worked." Remember it. She had remembered it, not just as information, as a way of being in relation to the land, not over it, not under it, not apart from it, in conversation with it, paying attention to what it offered and giving back what it needed, and building, over time, the kind of knowledge that couldn't be bought or forged or taken by legal maneuver. She thought about Silas Wren. 28 years of careful, private witnessing, waiting not for rescue but for the right moment, for the right person, for someone who came in with enough to make the documentation, mean something in a room that could act on it. She thought about the Calvert widow, who had sold, who had maybe not had anyone who said the decision is yours, who had maybe not had 28 years of someone else's careful record-keeping waiting for her. She thought about what she had, her father's knowledge, her own 5 years of observation, Silas Wren's 28 years of witnessing, Reston's survey maps, the termination clause she'd written into the contract herself, the drainage clause he'd added without being asked. The post Bodie had found already waiting at the east corner. None of it alone, all of it together. She rode the last mile to the ranch in the fading afternoon light, pulled up at the gate, looked at the place, the bleached house, the repaired barn, the fence line running straight and solid along the south boundary, the dormant garden under its straw mulch, waiting, the creek beyond the tree line, quieter in winter, but there, always there, the swept yard still swept. She dismounted, led her horse to the barn, unsaddled him, brushed him down methodically, starting at the neck, working back, no shortcuts. She did not take shortcuts with things that depended on her. Then she went inside, lit the lantern, sat at the kitchen table, opened the ledger to a clean page, wrote the date. December 14, 1878. The injunction was vacated. The lease is reinstated. Aldgate's conduct referred for formal review. Silas Wren's documentation submitted to the board and entered into the official record. The Halverson widow was in the room. She heard it. She looked at that last line, a dead. She said she would have stood up if she'd had what I had. She looked at the certificate on the wall, her name on it. Still there, still hers. Her father had told her something once, when she was small, when the world had seemed larger and more frightening and harder to navigate than it did. Now, he had said, the land doesn't know your name, but you know the land's name. Every stone, every water, every place where the ground breathes differently. That is the knowledge that keeps you here. Not the paper. The knowledge. She had the paper. She had always had the paper, but she had the knowledge too. And the knowledge was what had held when everything else was being pressed. When the lease was suspended, and the judge was bought, and the offer kept rising, and the fence kept getting cut. The knowledge had held. Because you couldn't suspend knowledge, couldn't buy it or cut it or issue injunction against it. It lived in her the way the water lived in the ground, deeper than any frost line, wider than any individual claim, feeding the surface from below regardless of who thought they owned the surface above. She closed the ledger 3 days later. December 17th, frost on the grass. The kind of morning that was cold and still and absolutely clear. The kind of clarity that came after something had been resolved, and the air itself seemed to know it. She was at the north pasture, checking the winter grass levels when she heard a horse on the west approach. She knew the rhythm. She didn't turn around immediately. Finished what she was doing, counted the stand, noted the growth, decided about the grazing rotation for January. Then she straightened. Retton rode up, dismounted, tied his horse. Walked to where she was standing, stood 6 feet away. 3 days, he said. Yes, she said. I have conditions, she said. Something moved through his expression. Quiet, warm, unhurried. The expression of a man who had been hoping for conditions and was glad to hear there were some. I expected you would, he said. The land stays registered separately. The 320 acres are mine. My name, my title. Not jointly, held, not transferred. Mine, agreed. I manage the Eastern Range records. The water documentation. The ledger system stays intact and continues under my management. I'd expect nothing less. And I don't become an ornament, she said. If I'm part of this operation, I'm part of it. The way I was part of fixing the fence. The way I was part of Cedar Falls. He looked at her steadily. I told my crew in October that you'd know more about your ranch than any of them, he said. I've known what I was looking at since the morning I saw your garden. I'm not here to make you an ornament. I've never needed one, and I wouldn't know what to do with one. The frost on the grass caught the morning light. Millions of small cold diamonds spread across the pasture, each one brief and specific and completely itself before the warmth took them. Then we're agreed, she said. She extended her hand. He firm, clean. The same as the first time on the porch, with the contract between them. Except this time, there was no contract between them. Just the handshake. Just the understanding arrived at through everything that had come before it, the termination clause, and the drainage clause, and the extra post and the dark repair of the fence, and the 12 miles ridden behind, and the 4 hours over survey maps, and the 40 minutes of waiting in the front row, and the 3 days of consideration. The look on his face was not relief, not triumph. It was the expression of a man who had been careful about something important and had found out the care was warranted. She understood that expression. She felt something close to it herself. Spring came the way it always did. Slow. Testing what the winter had left standing. The creek broke its ice in February, the edge plates dissolving first, the center current broadening as the temperature climbed. The garden earth thawed unevenly, dark patches of soft soil, appearing between the frozen sections like a sentence being revealed one word at a time. The garlic pushed through the straw, in early March, first. Always first. She had planted it in October, with Pruell's first visit, still fresh in her memory. With the knowledge that she might not be here to harvest it, she had planted it anyway. Because planting was an act of intention. Because you planted for this you intended to be present for. She had intended to be present, and she was. She planted the 3 sisters in the second week of April. Beans squashed the same circles her father had taught her. The same spacing. The same logic. The squash covering the ground. The beans fixing the nitrogen. The corn standing in the center. Each plucked plant doing something the others couldn't. The wholesome working, because of the relationship between the parts, the way it had always been done. She was turning the second planting row when she heard Reston's horse in the yard. She looked up. He rode in and dismounted. Walked to the garden edge. Stood there in the early spring light, with his hat in his hand, because the morning was warm enough that the hat wasn't needed. Beans again this year? He said. Beans, corn, and squash. The way it's always been done. He looked at the circles she was turning in the soil. At the pattern of them. At the particular intention visible in the way they were laid out. Not random, not decorative, but purposeful. Designed for the specific conditions of this specific ground. Sound decision, he said. She kept working. He stood at the garden edge and didn't come in. She worked and didn't invite him. But they were in the same morning, the same light, the same piece of earth that she knew the way she knew her own hands, and he was beginning to know the way you knew something that mattered, slowly, through attention. through being present to it over time. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. The new heading in the spring ledger read, Kalamazoo Ranch, Cimarron County, Kansas Territory. Spring 1879, her name second, her choice. Because her father had taught her that a name placed second by choice was not a lesser name. It was a name that had decided its own position, that had set its own terms, that knew its own weight and didn't need to announce it. She wrote the first entry of the season on a Tuesday morning in April. Creek running full at the crossing point. Bank compression within acceptable range. East pasture ready for first rotation. Garden, corn, beans, squash. Planted April 9. 3 sisters. Garlic up, she paused. A dead one more line. The land is the same land. The water is the same water. The knowledge is the same knowledge. What changed is that it is no longer held alone. She closed the ledger, set it on the shelf, looked at the certificate on the wall. Saya, Homestead Act 1862. Cimarron County, Kansas Territory. Granted 1873. Still there, still hers. Hers in the way it had always been hers. Not only because the paper said so, though the paper mattered, though the paper was proof, but because she knew it. Because she had walked every inch of it in every season. Because she knew where the water went underground and where it came back. Because she knew which section of the south fence sat on shifting soil, and which direction the ground moved in winter. Because she knew where to plant, and what to plant, and why the circles worked when the rows didn't. Because she had paid attention, for a very long time, to things most people didn't think were worth paying attention to. She went outside into the spring morning. The air smelled of thawed earth and coming warmth. The creek sound reached her from the tree line, fuller than it had been in months, finding its way south the way it had always found its way south, the way it would keep finding its way long after this particular spring was over. She crouched at the garden edge and pressed her palm flat against the soil, felt the temperature of it, the texture, the particular give of earth that was warming from the inside out, that had made it through another winter and was ready to be worked again. Her father had taught her this. Tell me what you feel. She felt the earth. Warming. Alive, patient, in the way that things were patient. When they understood that time moved in their favor, she felt it still. There is a kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself with silver-trimmed tack, doesn't arrive ahead of itself with letters of introduction, doesn't need to. It announces itself in a swept yard, at first light, in a fence line that holds through the first cattle push of spring, in the handwriting of a woman who understood that the strongest claims are built on knowledge, not need, not desperation, not fear of a man who arrives with a smile and a document, and a threat about how far you are from the nearest law office, on knowledge, the kind pressed into a child's palm against the cold ground of a Southwest valley, the kind written down because the person who holds it knows they won't live forever, the kind that spoken publicly in front of witnesses becomes impossible to steal. Kalamazoo Ranch, 320 acres, Cimarron County, Kansas Territory, spring 1879. The deed was not on the wall. It didn't need to be. Both of them knew exactly where it was, and both of them knew exactly what it meant. And neither of them needed to say it out loud, because some things are true whether you say them or not. And the truest things usually are.